The cost of basic goods is skyrocketing. There's a recession looming, rents in New York City are hitting an all-time high, and what does the Rent Guidelines Board do? Raise rents even higher.
New York City's Rent Guidelines Board held a vote on Tuesday night on a measure to raise rents on New York City's 2.5 million rent-stabilized tenants by 3.25% for one-year leases and 5% for two-year leases. Tenants and housing organizations attended all the prior hearings where tenants testified again and again that even a small increase in rent would push renters over the brink. On the night of the vote, the room was packed. Tenants with matching shirts waved signs and chanted their demand for a rent rollback. Everything indicated that the public overwhelmingly opposed the rent increase. Yet it passed. Why would the Rent Guidelines Board pass a measure that would make housing even less accessible when the public was overwhelmingly demanding the opposite? First, you have to understand what the board is. It's a committee of 9 people appointed by the mayor that sets the lease guidelines for rent-stabilized apartments in New York City. The board has 2 tenant representatives, 2 landlord representatives, and 5 public representatives. They say this is supposed to guarantee that everyone's voice is heard. But there is traditionally another way of representing the interests of large groups of people. It's called voting. So why don't we have elections for the Rent Guidelines Board? Probably because if we could vote for the Rent Guidelines Board, people would only vote for candidates who would pledge not to raise the rent. This is how we ended up with public representatives like Arpit Gupta, who has a history of making public comments against rent stabilization, and another, Chairman David Reese, who defended the rent increase the night of the vote using the same logic of the landlords.
This year, overall prices for owner expenses increased 4.2% in the PIOC for rent-stabilized apartment buildings. In other words, old or fully stabilized buildings have high cost-to-income ratios that may become unsustainable in the near future, particularly if inflation remains at its current high levels.
Of course, anyone who lives in New York City knows no matter how much rent you pay, repairs never come. But the most damning fact might be that the board is mandated by law to adjust rent guidelines to maintain the, quote, economic condition of the residential real estate industry.
The passage of the HSTPA in 2019 squarely places the burden of providing owners with enough revenue to maintain their buildings on the RGB.
The Rent Guidelines Board masquerades as a democratic institution that hears out everyone's concerns and makes an impartial judgment. But this latest rent hike proves that even if the public overwhelmingly opposes a measure, even if you pack the entire discussion hall with opposition, public opinion can still be overridden by the so-called experts.
If this were a truly democratic institution, the interests of 2.5 million rent-stabilized tenants would obviously outweigh the interests of a handful of landlords. And New York City isn't alone in this. Throughout the country, there are all kinds of unelected boards that make crucial decisions about our lives. Tuition boards, transit boards, the Federal Reserve Board, the Supreme Court. Even if you can vote in elections, it's often these unelected bodies that make the most crucial decisions about our lives. If this latest rent hike proves anything, it's how completely hollow our democracy really is.